is tremendous satisfaction in a big, long job, finished and done well. Think back to something that took you ages to do. Maybe a building project or a renovation, something for your work, or maybe just spring cleaning the house, top to bottom. That last nail hammered in, that last word written, the last cupboard cleaned, or maybe that last batch of St. Andrew's shortbreads baked and boxed. I bet it felt good to be done, satisfying to have done it well. Coming from a farming background, I have spent many days in the hot sun every summer, cutting and raking and baling hay, and then stacking hundreds and sometimes even thousands of hay bales in sheds and barns. I also remember very well the feeling of stowing that last hay bale in the loft. It's relief that the job was done for the year, but it's also a feeling of security and abundance, knowing that all of our animals would have enough to eat all winter long. Getting the hay in is a huge weight off a farmer's mind, and I imagine Boaz felt much the same when he finished harvesting the grain that year. Weeks of work, long into the evening, and finally his granary is full. And a full granary means abundance and security, and enough to look after himself and all of the people he's responsible for until next year's harvest. So Boaz eats and drinks and celebrates, and then collapses on his heap of grain for a well-earned night's rest. When we take up Ruth's story today, several weeks, the rest of the harvest season, have passed. Because of Ruth's courage in going out into the fields and Boaz's generosity in return, the two women have been doing all right. But Naomi is beginning to worry about Ruth's future long term. And she knows that Boaz is a good man, so Naomi encourages Ruth to approach him, seeking a more lasting rescue from their uncertain situation. So Ruth sheds her widow's clothes, visibly setting aside her grief and her mourning, and she goes to Boaz. It's striking that this time there's no mention of danger. Before, both Naomi and Boaz were very clearly worried whenever Ruth, a young foreign widow, went out into the community that she'd be assaulted or harmed wherever she went. This time, though, there's no mention of risk. Ruth sneaks in and curls up at Boaz's feet, which seems like an odd, uncomfortable sort of thing to do from our perspective. But what she's trying to do is physically remind him how vulnerable and how much she needs his help. And of course, Ruth, being who she is, manages to be both vulnerable and mind-blowingly courageous and bold all at the same time. When Boaz wakes up in the night, she asks him to marry her, using the same language of protection and refuge, of being taken under a protector's wing that he used himself the first time they met. And she reminds him that he is her family redeemer, a legal role in Israelite society that would let him save her. Now, believe it or not, in the last several thousand years, the process of harvesting grain hasn't really changed that much from Boaz's day, although we've got mechanical equipment, tractors and things to do it now instead of people power. When the grain is ripe, the stalk is cut. Threshing loosens the edible bit of the grain from the rest of the plant. In Boaz's day, this was done by beating the bundles of grain on the threshing floor. Winnowing was done in the evenings to take advantage of the breeze to blow the chaff away, leaving only the essential edible grain behind. When it comes to understanding God's saving work in the world, redemption is kind of like the final product of the harvest. All the straw and the chaff are gone, and we are left with the essential heart of our faith. Understanding God as the Trinity is one of the brain-bending moments of our Christian faith. How is God our Creator and also Jesus and also the Holy Spirit all at the same time? And yet we know that God is all three and still just the one. I find kind of a simpler way of thinking about the Trinity is through our own experiences of what God does for us and in us. And the essential work that God does is the work of redemption. Now, as immense and powerful and mysterious as our Creator God is, as complex and awe-inspiring, what we see from the very beginning, as far back as Genesis chapter 1, is also a God who wants to have a close relationship with us. And when that breaks down, God does not withdraw from us or cut us off. He gives us more of himself instead. Through Christ's death and resurrection and the promise of a coming kingdom, God makes healing and restoration possible. God offers us hope and a future where life is full and abundant again, where the relationship between God and us is restored and made new once more. And even now, that future, that abundant new life is alive in us through the power of the Holy Spirit. This is redemption. What is broken is made whole, what's lost is found, and what is empty is filled abundantly once more. All of this just to bring us back into the relationship with God that we were always meant to have. When Ruth proposes marriage to Boaz and reminds them that he is able, by the laws of Israelite society, to redeem her family, Boaz is blown away. Ruth is younger than him and of noble character, and he thinks she's a bit of a catch for any young man in their community. But she's chosen him, asked him to save her and Naomi, and Boaz immediately starts planning out how he can get it done. The first part of Ruth chapter 4 is all about his negotiations with the elders of the community and the other potential family redeemer. It's about how he claims Ruth as his wife and takes Naomi and her dead husband's property into his care. And all these promises that he makes to Ruth and Naomi are witnessed by the whole community. It's done. Ruth and Naomi are redeemed, rescued from uncertainty and an empty future. There's a really subtle and beautiful gesture, though, that Boaz makes near the end of the story. Before he sends Ruth home to Naomi, he loads her up with as much barley as she can carry because he doesn't want her to go home empty-handed to her mother-in-law. Now, when Ruth and Naomi first came back to Judah, Naomi mourned and lamented that she had returned home bitter and empty, with no real future for either of them. And now, what was empty is full. Hope is restored, and their future is secure. Ruth's story of redemption, her life transformed and restored, and Naomi's right along with her, is like a picture of God's big story of redeeming everything, made small and personal so that we can understand it. God acts through Boaz to transform Ruth's life, from widow to foreigner to field worker to wife. All the broken pieces of Ruth's life are healed and renewed and transformed. From her economic insecurity to her grieving heart, all of Ruth's needs are met abundantly. And you can see this transformation, this journey that Ruth makes in just the little bit that we read today. She sheds her widow's clothes, letting go of her old self and her old life, so she can put on the new life that being redeemed will offer her. She makes what should be a risky move, going to Boaz alone in the middle of the night, and yet it isn't risky at all because of who Boaz is and what he is like. She is vulnerable and in great need, and yet she trusts enough to ask for redemption, and she's brave enough to accept the changes that it'll bring to her life. If this journey that Ruth makes on that night at the end of the harvest season so long ago, if that journey sounds kind of familiar to you, that's good, because it should. We are all Ruth. Her journey is the same journey we all make when we reach out to our triune God and are drawn into the new and abundant life that he offers us, into that transforming and saving love. We are all Ruth. Thanks be to God. Amen.